Thank you, Michael, very much for that wonderful introduction. And of course, Cooper Union for inviting me to be here. I've wanted to come here and get involved in some capacity for a very long time. And of course, I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I know the pressure to kind of wind down and decompress is something, it's quite a force, so I appreciate you coming out. So my lecture is titled Speculative Futures, Imminence and Imminence. And imminence with an I is sort of an impending condition, and imminence with an A is sort of an inherent state of being, and I think that's a good way to sort of in a very oblique way categorize the kind of work and world building that I do. I'm going to discuss my practice, architectural / artistic practice in sort of a chronological order. And I always like to begin with my thesis project. I feel it encapsulates two things. The first being my conceptual narratives that I deploy. And as I begin to explain the ideas behind my thesis and discuss other works, you'll see how that comes together. The second thing is that my actual creative process, I do a lot of analog and digital sort of back and forth exchanges in my work, starting with sketches or starting with a 3D model and printing out the 3D model renderings and sketching over and, you know, scanning it back in. So you'll see a lot of that, and it's very much sort of maintained in my thesis. It's called a Bhikkhu phenomenon. And so you're looking at a series, so this is a blend of computer model as well as trace drawings. So I'll try and breeze through this if I can, but there's a little bit of cultural background I've got to give. I'm from Nigeria, I'm Yoruba, and the Yoruba believe that life is cyclical, right? So you were born, you live, you have children, you die, you join the ancestors, and then you repeat that cycle. There's a spirit that disrupts that cycle that could inhabit a child. It's called an Abiku spirit. And it sort of deals with this belief that when a family may lose several children at a very young age, that child is inhabited by an Abiku spirit. So that's a very deeply entrenched sort of cultural belief in Yoruba culture. But it does have a political application to it, called an Abiku phenomenon. And what that means that it actually has a positive application. So the Abiku in sort of the cultural understanding disrupts life, but in the political and socioeconomic understanding, it disrupts this cycle of violent military coups. So an Abiku phenomenon is a sort of positive outcome of Nigeria's political trajectory as it sort of, you know, evolves towards a democracy. So, now I said that. That idea, so that's about taking this myth that applies, or it's belief that applies to sort of cultural condition, and then intentionally misappropriating that myth and applying it to the political and social spectrum. So I kind of took that as a sort of one-to-one way of form making. At the time, there was a program called Form Z, so this is 1999, and Form Z has a function called Quick Paint, and it's a completely useless function. It doesn't calculate correctly along the Z-axis. So if you build a model of a house and you have a back porch and a front door, and you hit the Quick Paint render, it could throw the back porch in front of the front door. So it just makes absolutely no sense. It's almost insane to me that it was part of this early CAD practice. But true to the way I like to use computer software, I use them what they're not intended for, how they can work with articulating my narratives. I saw it disrupting the Z-axis, similar to the Abiku, kind of disrupting time, you know, as sort of progresses forward. So I started with building a 3D model, and I guess I'll click through some of these. I started with building a 3D model of a king's palace, which existed from pre-colonial through colonial times in Nigeria. And then what I did was I set cameras in different rooms and different areas throughout this model, and I used Quick Paint, and I ran 4 iterations of it, one at 10 seconds, one at 20 seconds, one at 30 seconds, one at 40 seconds. So you're looking at the fragments the intentional misreading of this palace structure, right? And then so what I then did is that I took each of those fragments from all the different quadrants and all the different corners, and I projected them back in the plan. And then from there I pieced them back together and then extruded and built 4 separate buildings, 4 separate constructs. So it's kind of a very self-indulgent, esoteric way of kind of form making, right? And thinking about generative processes and the blend of digital and analog. And I could never find drawings. They're on a hard drive or a zip drive, which might precede most of you guys, a zip drive somewhere, the kind of forms that came out of it. But what I really like about this is you see the computer model, but then you see all of the overlays and the lines and me trying to figure out exactly how one projects perspective back in the plan. So that idea of really belaboring the relationship between digital and analog is at the root of a lot of what I do, both as I, pursue conceptual, political, ecological, environmental narratives, simultaneously thinking about how I visualize those narratives, how the way that I create either a 3D model or a 2D drawing, how it conveys the ideas that I'm after. So I feel it's a very kind of good entree into the work that I do. It is also, in absence of going to an fine arts program or an MFA program, they were the drawings that I used to apply for a residency. So I'm a visual artist. The first residency I did was with Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, and so my thesis drawings were in my application for this. And so this was 2004, and this was shortly, just a few years after 9/11, and the LMCC is located in the financial district, or it was before 9/11, and then it was displaced and then returned in 2004. So I was part of the sort of first class of LMCC residents back in the financial district. So there was a loose thematic surrounding the idea of sort of violence and renewal. So I came up with this fictional office called NYC DUC, Department of Urban Codification and Kinesthetics. And I used that as a way of sort of examining some urban planning, organizational issues, also once again working through my aesthetic. And so this is the early days, so I'm still very much heavily in architecture mode in the process. And so my collages are very much the sort of sketching, elevational, perspectival, note-taking, so a lot of the sort of processes one develops a project. This is called Subway as Intermediary Space. So I had 4 of these, but I really only like 3, so I only show 3. Subway as Intermediary Space was sort of my response to being in New York City and thinking about the way one sort of maps space personally. It took me 2 years to realize that my favorite club or bar or restaurant or coffee shop was in proximity to my other favorite bar, club, or restaurant or coffee shop, because of the simple fact in New York, you go down underground, you ride a subway, then you emerge. So there's no kind of connect from how you arrive there. And so I take the C to go to this restaurant, and I take the 1, 2, 3 to go to this coffee shop. And it wasn't until I kind of walked around above ground that I realized only 2 blocks away. So I thought of this idea of, as it sort of one approaches major subway stops and nodes, that huge swaths of the sort of space surrounding the subway is excavated. So kind of like a lowered, elevated train sort of system, and then building programming around that. And so this was just thinking through that and doing a series of renderings and taking notes and thinking about the significance of that for sort of larger urban planning. So this is sort of a more kind of almost like an architectural project. The next one is the inverted panopticon. And for this one, the site was not Manhattan, but actually a map of Manhattan. So I began by printing out sort of a Xerox map and blowing it up and cutting into it and playing around with it and opening it up. Like actually just expanding this map to sort of fit the idea of this panoptical inversion. And as you may know, the panopticon has a sort of strong historical prominence in the world of architecture as a sort of architecture of control and surveillance. And so I was thinking about creating this sort of panoptical city where the seat of authority and power is sort of inverted and placed in sort of opposition to the way it is in kind of prison architecture, with a loose conceptual idea of the population and the inhabitants kind of making sure that the powers that be are kind of held accountable. So once again, it's this blend of both analog and digital ideas, but then also with a sort of conceptual political narrative working through ideas. This one is more fantastical. I think I zoom in a bit. So there you can see a little bit of, the ideas that I'm thinking about. And these were printed out. They're 72 by 50. So what is that, like 7 feet? No, 6 feet by 5 feet, I believe. So these were large. And I built these like office walls. And so, they had studio visits. And at this point, I'm kind of creating work that people can spend a lot of time with, I even did this sort of, sort of like created this kind of like gestation period for Manhattan, thinking about it slowly swelling over the years to sort of create this space for this panoptical city. One of the studio visits that came out of that was with Christine Kim, who at the time was a curator at the Studio Museum at Harlem. And she, she liked the work, but she wanted to, she invited me to be part of an exhibit. And we thought about it for years. And I ended up being in the Flow exhibit in 2008. And they invited, I believe, 30 artists from throughout the African diaspora. The conversation being, what does contemporary African art look like? And it shouldn't have been a radical show, but it ended up being a radical show because the perception of African art for the longest time has always been kind of sculptures and masks and statues, and so kind of getting a grasp of what that work would look like ended up being very fascinating, because of course it looked like whatever the artists were creating and making. It was an incredibly diverse show. So for myself, I took a departure from my kind of heavy-handed textual, architectural drawing collages to create 4 sculptures, or in the art world we call them architectural maquettes. So there's like a different language, if you will. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but a lot of my work, because I'm fascinated by utopias and dystopias, I'm very much inspired by science fiction. So much of what I do is kind of projecting my ideas and concepts and considerations into sort of future worlds. And so this one is called, I always forget the name, Variable Facility. Yeah, does it say that? Yes. And so I was thinking, of just this sort of housing, perhaps in outer space, on Mars, or the moon, but again, very abstracted. And I was really enjoying kind of stepping away from, the prior work that you saw and just having fun, building this interesting series of models. This one actually was inspired by mining facilities that I visited in South Africa maybe 3 or 4 years earlier. And I forget the name again, but you get the gist. And this is interesting because it's funny, having this architectural background, so I built this model and then I didn't add expansion joints in the sort of slats on the floor. So as the show progressed, you see the floor beginning to sort of warp and kind of like by the end, it was almost like this rolling sea. So I was sort of pretending that it was this kind of time-composed performance art of this model as the show progresses. This one was very interesting because this was, and I mine my work frequently, right? So I have a library of my own sketches and drawings and works and models and ideas that have seen the light or have not seen the light that I dip back into and then flip it and then, you know, maybe work in a different material or a different scale. And so this actually began as a series of drawings and sketches as part of the AIA competition to design sort of research outposts in Greenland for the study of kind of like Inuit culture. And so I decided to make a model of it. And it's fascinating being in the context of the Studio Museum of Harlem and in a show about African artists. There was a write-up in the Village Voice around the show, and the author mentioned this work and was describing the idea of this work sort of takes the hull of the slave ship and it inverts it and sort of turning it on its end and reimagining a sort of celebratory or triumphance or resilientness out of this metaphor, right? And for me, this was an Inuit research station. So it's just funny being in art world or being in any venue and switching any venue and the sort of presumptions or ideas that people will project onto the work. And even outside of, you know, this particular context, just coming from an architectural background and moving in the art world, the way your work is received and perceived and responded to, for me is continually an enormously interesting thing to sort of experience. And I enjoy sort of reimagining my work and writing about it in different ways. And this was more about a sort of fractal exercise then built over this sort of abstraction of a 9-square grid. So again, I'm just, you know, sort of evolution of coming from an architectural background and navigating the world of a fine arts, visual arts practice. Around this time, I did another series of shows, Settlements, Surfaces, and Armatures, and Urban Growth Strategies. So now I'm fully departing from the very textual, layered, collage-like architectural work and trying to sort of let a singular visual, communicate my ideas. And here I've always been very much interested in kind of reimagining futuristic city settlements that draw on certain typologies that exist now. So this one was called Central City Settlements. It's sort of labyrinthine-like architecture that you would find in the Middle East or in North Africa or certain areas of South America or in Spain, you know, sort of very close buildings with sort of narrow walkways and sort of a kind of decentralized sort of organization. But visually, it's interesting because this is a computer model, and so these all began as computer models, and then what I did was rendered out a kind of low resolution photoreal image and then ran it through a program. First, I used to run it through Illustrator, but I found a better program called Vector Magic. And it vectorizes photographs. So it approximates the lines and the colors and all of that stuff. And what it does is if you know, the lower resolution image you give it, the sort of looser sort of image it produces. So what happens, it kind of creates this almost hand-drawn, painterly-like quality. And then I overlay it back with sort of hard line images from the original model. So again, it's a kind of blend, sort of way of playing with you know, this kind of digital technology. And so these are images of the city settlements. Again, my fascination with urban planning, with cityscapes. accompanying this, this is surface armatures. So I'm taking more of a sort of sci-fi inspired direction with these, and these are, you know, so have less sort of overarching political narratives. They're more about just sort of architectural interventions and playing with the mediums and playing around with software. And I should also say I use SketchUp exclusively for my 3D modeling and 3D works. So this is SketchUp, and these images I began with a series of photographs that either I had taken or a friend of mine had taken of sort of abandoned and dilapidated industrial buildings, post-industrial buildings, placed them into SketchUp, traced over them, and then extruded the different surfaces. And SketchUp's good for that. You can do it incredibly quickly. And then creating these sort of futuristic, human-scaled interventions onto these facades, almost like prosthetic devices. So this was just, again, kind of a series of playing around with you know, architectural tropes, the elevation, the perspective, the idea of armature and prostheses. And again, and interesting thing, so the sci-fi sort of dystopian idea behind these, because at this point I'm not including any sort of scale figures. So for me, I'm seeing these works almost as almost like archaeological finds. So they're images that exist in the future beyond where we reside, but then as the audience and observers of this work, it is almost like we're looking back at civilizations that preceded us and existed before us. So it's kind of a sort of dual idea of the relationship between projecting artwork forward and being an observer of that artwork, which inherently makes you a kind of archaeologist looking at a sort of excavation site. These were called urban growth strategies, and I found in some old chemistry book a series of microscopic slides of microscopic imagery of various liquids interacting on a cellular level. And I was just interested, to me they sort of jumped out as interesting ways of potentially organizing cities and city spaces and public spaces and ex-urban spaces and suburban spaces. So I just started to trace around these photographs and then sort of create these abstracted, planar, fictional cities, sort of navigating through these spaces and also thinking about the potential scale or sort of the programmatic potential of these things. An interesting thing at this time, I'm still a young, starving artist, and so this was for an exhibit at the Photo Gallery in Chelsea. I think it was called Visionaries and Outcasts. And so I was printing these works out at Columbia, because my friend was doing a PhD at Columbia at the time, in the urban preservation department. And so I was doing it late at night, where I could print for free. And it was interesting because all the planning students, so as I printed them out, I would lay them out on a desk. And then the planning students came over, and it was just interesting to see them start naming the types of sort of city organizations that they were, because they thought it was a real thing that I was doing, you know? So they're like, oh yeah, this is spoken wheel, no wait. And they started arguing about what, you know, type of sort of city strategies these images, you know, were referencing. And so it was interesting for me, like coming back in and overhearing their conversations, to see the fact that this kind of self-organizing, microscopic imagery could sort of have a relevant projection on a kind of macro scale for developing cities. Liminal is what we call it in the art world. When you want to do something, but you want to sort of indemnify yourself from a kind of critical rigor. You don't want to be an expert. So I'm in liminal spaces between urban design and abstraction of etc. So it's and that's an interesting thing in art world and architecture. There's in art world there's less sort of accountability around the images that you produce. And I still have so much of that studio environment in my heart and soul. There is my drive to explain it to you, right? And to justify why I did what I did. At the same time as that previous project, this is 2008, there was a show at the Kitchen called Future is Disruption. So I collaborated with a friend of mine that I went to Cornell with, but he was I think a literature major, and then he got a master's and a PhD in history. And so I collaborated with him to come up with this project called AdverSpeak and the Public-Private Partnership Program. And so he came up with this really comprehensive narrative about the dollar failing and all these commodities failing, and major companies then buying out currency in these commodities and creating a world that is solely about perpetuating their brand, right? And so that's AdverSpeak. PPP is a kind of governing body, and AdverSpeak is a sort of social, cultural body. And AdverSpeak is pretty much the way you speak about brands now when you're having your Beats headphones and you're telling your friends how awesome the sound is. You know, you're doing this legwork for these major brands, but in this world, you're getting paid to do that. In fact, your ability to effectively promote any number of brands is how you make a living. So it's interesting thinking about visualization and how, or representation, and how it kind of works to push the idea. So you see this is a complete departure from the kind of painterly work that I did prior, and now highly digital, almost 8-bit looking sort of architecture, because this world was about kind of total surveillance, total control, sort of rigid class structure, sort of absurd bureaucracy. And we also had fun naming each of these works. They have these very long, alliterative, bureaucratic terms that we had a lot of fun coming up with. This is the gap map, and it's called the Greater Area Protocol Map, but of course it is also owned by GAP. And you can see sort of the details of this world. So they're similar to the earlier works by overloading a lot of kind of information about this world and about the particular narratives, but in a kind of highly controlled, more digital way. And so, sorry, this is a sort of on the perimeter. So each individual in this world takes an aptitude test, and I'll show you the documents in the next slides. And how well you perform on this aptitude test determines what your ranking is, from RSR0 to RSR04. So RSR0s are in the service industry, they're on the perimeters and these sort of refugee camps and tents. And RSR04 is sort of like these luxury high-rise buildings in the center. And so again, we have these fun names: human interaction and verbal exchanges, the Hive data silo. Data silo records all human interactions, and verbal exchanges are permanently stored in these data silos. And then the security arm that surveils the populace 24/7 is the 3SC2S, Sector Surveillance, Service Center, and Synaptic Sites. And so we made a series of these bureaucratic documents that we believe would be in this handbook. And so this one is called the 2C3Q. It is a construct to calculate quantifiable quality of AdverSpeak quotients. And what it is, it's a document that pertains to each of the specific brands that you are speaking for and advocating for. And it is a sort of document they use to kind of determine the responses you get, and kind of qualify and quantify those responses based on a positive, negative, or neutral response, derived from your nouns, your adjectives. So every aspect of language in this world we created is being monitored and processed, and to sort of take note of kind of what response you're eliciting in every single word. So it's not even like Coca-Cola is great. It is Coca-Cola is wonderful. And what does changing great to wonderful, you know, determine for how Coca-Cola is branded, you know? The next one is the appended algorithm for the average annual average peak accumulation quotient. So this is your sort of year-end review of your ability to promote these brands, right? And so this is an example, is Nike. And the image on the right is the aptitude test, and it is the 5AC. It is the average applicant aptitude for average speak advocate candidacy. And it's a very simple test, but the sort of psychological ramifications of it are sort of hard to really understand, right? They can, we imagine the administrators of this test can gain much more from this sort of simple breakdown than a more comprehensive test. And the interesting thing is, a lot of these images I actually borrowed from kind of Cold War era and Soviet era interrogation tests, enemy of the people matrices that they would break down, and then just switched out our own information. So these diagrams are coming from actual sort of fascist regimes that have existed in our world and that exist now, right? So it's so the currency is a sort of cryptocurrency. But there's an avatar for the cryptocurrency. We were interested in the fact that, thinking about the dollar bill, it has all of this occult symbology to it. We used a mandala for this because of how it sort of encompasses the entire world, right? So it's no longer a nationalized or localized cryptocurrency. It's sort of now embodies the entire globe. And so the sort of imagery shows the different regions throughout the world that are a part of this sort of new world order. And the tagline, you know, the dollar one is what is Novus Ordo Seclorum, and this one is an empire, Imperium Sin Fide, which is an empire without end in Latin. And then the next image, this image is the key to the prior image. So it breaks down everything that you see in this image. It explains everything. There's even here a kind of chronological historical timeline. So this was something that, you know, people who were there at the exhibit were like reading through an incredible amount of information, you know, because my collaborator, he wrote this entire huge dissertation about this world, and then my job was to sort of distill it down into the wall we were given for our artwork. So it's like, how do I corral an enormous amount of information into, you know, a sort of 15 by 10 foot wall? And so the decision was to show the gap map, which kind of showed the way individuals could navigate. And interestingly enough, we also used, for thinking about the kind of way individuals could navigate, we're looking at apartheid era South African pass law, explaining how you know, those who were, you know, who were in service and navigating through neighborhoods, what the sort of procedure was for how they would navigate, where the checkpoints were. So it's a lot of information. So if you were if you were there, you would be reading through a lot of kind of what we were thinking about. So then, when I get tired of sitting in front of my computer all day, which is what I do probably 14, 16 hours a day, I like to draw. Just kind of step away and sort of go back to sort of architectural, but again, still fun, whimsical, still influenced by my ideas. So these are series of small-scale drawings that I call Political Impermanence of Place, and they loosely reflect the fact that I've lived in Crown Heights, Brooklyn for 19 years now, thinking about how the neighborhood has changed, thinking about buildings being torn down, thinking about neighborhoods being designated as blighted neighborhoods, thinking about gentrification, thinking about the evolution of these spaces, and then just reflecting in these sort of very playful, whimsical, you know, I think these are 9 by 12, so about that big. So, you know, sort of very small drawings. So, and this is a nice exercise. I've done a number of residencies, and residencies sort of afford me the opportunity to step away from a computer and build things by hand and do drawings by hand, both not having space in my apartment at home, but also, you know, being mired in commission work in addition to trying to create self-motivated work. Residencies are the opportunity for me to just draw or make collages or build models or explore different things. And so, you know, you'll see throughout the work that I'm showing kind of moments when I step away to create hand-drawn and handmade artworks. Then I always return to the digital. So this is interesting. From 2008 to 2012, so I had the Flow shows at the museum in Harlem, which was a big show. Future Disruption was at the kitchen, it was a big show. So I'm poised in my kind of artistic career to then continue to grow, you know. But I just decided for some inexplicable reason to pivot and start an architectural firm with my friends. And I stopped making art for 4 whole years and tried to get an architecture firm off the ground. And then in 2012, I was like, I don't want to do this. I was like, I don't like going to an office, even if the office is my own office. I still don't like going to it. So this is the next series of works. I hadn't made work in 4 years, and I wanted to make work quickly to apply for grants and residencies. So I made these. They're urban installation studies. These are just digital renderings, right? But they're what I would make if I had a huge budget, if I had a nice big space to kind of think of, you know, the sort of architectural constructs, you know, that I would build. So the renderings that you see, I have little moments of sort of showing the scale. So I have a little triangle here, and in this one, I have the broom over here, you know, just kind of giving you a sense. And so I used these works, and I made a lot of these. And I just used these images to apply again to artist residencies and you can kind of get back in the fine arts game, right? I actually built a model of this one, and it's traveling. It doesn't look as cool as this, of course, because I was kind of got it over my head. I was like, yeah, I can build this, and then I built it. Kind of looked like the, you know those memes where they have like nailed it, where they show you something amazing, and then they show like someone trying to make a Pinterest cake that they see, and then their version is ridiculous. That was kind of like my, you know, this rendering versus the kind of 3D model. No, it's exciting. So a lot of these are again, just they're very formal and compositional exercises. A lot of them come from photographs that my brother has taken. So this is on the University of Chicago campus. I think that's a Saranen building, and I'm kind of like reconfiguring it in different ways. And again, just really enjoying playing around with you know, color and composition and shadow and light, and just the idea of having an endless budget to create whatever installation that I could create, and imagine it being in, you know, somewhere like the Tate Modern or some, you know, really nice fancy institution. And it worked. These images were very well received. I got residencies off of them. I got grants from these. I also just had, you know, different people reaching out, with sort of general interest. And that's the thing I have to say, a lot of what I've done, so for these works, so I created these, they're completely self-initiated projects. But what I do, and what I had done at the time was then just to submit these to all of the different architectural blogs, from Art Daily to D-Zine to even Design Sponge, even, you know, just in Habitat, just literally just come up with the write-up, send all these images out, and this was featured on a lot of them. And so it managed to sort of generate then, because this is around 2013, 2014, where the transition to sort of digital publication is now the sort of prominent way. And so now older publications are looking to blogs and digital content for their content. So this work sort of allowed me to get kind of more attention for the kind of things I was doing, created an opportunity for me then to get different residencies and pursue different work. And like I said, I did a lot of these. I just kept, you know, I was really enjoying just kind of thinking about it and churning it out. And it's sometimes fun not to have any sort of overarching idea or political narrative, and just enjoy thinking about, you know, these compositions and kind of building typologies. I'll breeze through. So one of the first residencies I got after these was with the School of Visual Arts at the Visible Futures Lab. And this is a really cool one because they give you access to CNC machine, laser cutter, 3D printer, sort of all of these different kind of fabrication tools. So I just really fell in love with the laser cutter. And I spent all my time there just, you know, coming up with different patterns and thinking around it, you know, thinking about these different patterns. So for this work, I initially started thinking about, it was a sort of very loose idea. At the time I'd been reading different things and kind of like sort of French press around like a lot of Islamophobia. So what I was interested in doing was I first began by building these models of French row houses and mixed row houses, and then sort of draping them and kind of making them ornate with sort of Islamic geometries and really overlaying it over this sort of very you know, French European sort of building type. You see a lot of these row houses, a lot of these sort of, you know, French row houses in Paris. But then I just really was excited with the laser cutter and patterns in general. So then from there, it just expanded out into thinking about different patterns. I was even looking at like fashion houses like, I think like Chanel and Balenciaga and some of their vintage lace patterns as well. And so I just was having a lot of fun with creating what I imagined to be kind of, again, as I mentioned earlier, you know, things projected into the future, but then because we're the observer, they sort of exist in the past as well. So that's why this project is called Temporal Relics. It's the idea of kind of looking at works simultaneously in the future but out of time. And in the sci-fi genre, I'm very interested in steampunk. Steampunk takes a sort of Renaissance and Victorian architecture, and it's about making these interesting brass contraptions. So it's futuristic, but through this sort of Victorian, you know, 18th, 17th century lens. So I was also thinking, what if steampunk was similar to that, you know, kind of historical science fiction construct, but not through a strictly Western architectural, you know, or social lens. So this is almost like, I call it sort of Occidental Islamic steampunk, thinking about, you know, what a sort of non-Western sort of sci-fi imagery in that regard would look like. So these were really fun, and so the scale of these, this is like 15, I think that's, no, 16 inches. Yeah, so it's about this big. And the introduction of the acrylic is I wanted to add color to it, but I did not want to have to paint it, and I had a laser cutter. And also the sort of juxtaposition of sort of this stained wood with this very bright acrylic really gave it a kind of more playful look. So I was really enjoying, you know, sort of playing around with these things. So this is a Precursor New Africa 2081. This is a collaboration with myself and a friend of mine who, first he was a drum and bass producer, then he was a lawyer, and now he runs a bespoke menswear line called Ikere Jones. And like myself, he's from Nigeria, Yoruba as well. Like myself, grew up in the States. And his menswear line sort of has a kind of custom European tailoring juxtaposed with a lot of West African prints. And so for the launch of his line, he had seen some of the futuristic stuff I had done, and he wanted to create a series of campaign images that would juxtapose Lagos, Nigeria, as it exists now, with a sort of futuristic sci-fi sensibility. These images are the most, by far, and I can't even express it enough, by far the most important work I've done to this date, for the sheer fact that, you know, I just did these images for him, and there were 4. He threw them up on his Tumblr page in addition to launching his line. And I guess just the idea of seeing the kind of informal kind of settlement, you know, architecture and construct of an African city, an urban African city, juxtaposed with sci-fi imagery was far more radical than we felt it was, but it was insanely radical because the amount of response we got from doing this work literally transformed both of our careers, you know what I mean, completely. We were reached out by so many brands from like Lancome and L'Oreal and, you know, all these different folks who were so enamored with this imagery and wanted us to either reproduce this imagery for their brand or wanted to show the work or wanted to, you know, a Polish filmmaker. I mean, even to this day, this was done in 2013, 14, and even to this day, I will still probably get at least 10 emails a month asking about this work specifically, and, you know, could I do something that does this, or just some general interest in showing it, discussing it, exhibiting it, you know, individuals wanting usage rights for the image for whatever they're discussing. So this has had a sort of tremendous impact on you know, sort of my ability to kind of move forward and feed myself through art specifically. And this is the image that was not part of that series. This was done for a Spanish business magazine, and it was about best practices for doing work in West African countries. If you're an individual wanting to sort of start a business there, understanding a lot of the sort of cultural, you know, etiquette for conducting business. So it sort of shows the sort of which Lagos, Nigeria, you'll see a lot of if you visit is simultaneous, a kind of very, you know, polished, you know, venture capitalist sort of development simultaneously with this informal market culture. And that led into this project, which I've been doing now for the past 5 years, shanty megastructures for Lagos, Nigeria. And this has been ongoing, and it'll continue to grow. I'm now on sort of the 4th iteration of this project. It initially started looking at the 3rd mainland bridge, which connects Lagos Island to the mainland. And that bridge is notorious, almost has a mythical reputation for the nightmarish traffic So I thought of sort of building this large skyscraper sculpture, structure along the Third Mainland Bridge, so that it wasn't connecting 2 points, but the bridge itself became an actual site destination. And it was just a sort of early skyscraper design. I left it alone. And then after the project that I just showed you, the collaboration, and it's so funny how it works with the sort of work that I do and how I move forward. I was so tired of people reaching out to me with this work that I had collaborated on that I had to get permission every time I showed. So people would email Wale, they'd email me, and you'd have to be like, oh, I just got contacted by so-and-so. Do you want to do this? You know what I mean? And it was so hard to generate interest in my work outside of that imagery. And I was like, I have to do something in Africa that I author completely myself. So this was part of my decision to kind of undertake this, but also a general interest in Lagos as an enormously fascinating site. It's one of the fastest growing megacities in the world. It's the largest megacity in Africa. There's so many interesting contradictions. There's an enormous amount of sort of creative ingenuity, but it's also incredibly chaotic. Like I mentioned, nightmares, traffic, very little infrastructure. There's tons of development going on in Lagos, Nigeria, but it's all mostly aspirational and primarily focused on kind of luxury development. Very little of it takes into account or considers slums and informal settlements. You're looking at Makoko Village. And so, I just thought of the kind of erasure of these communities, both in the sort of public imagination for how they would exist in these futures, in the future of a city, in the future of a place, like Lagos, Nigeria. And I always show this picture because it's not just endemic to Lagos. It's all over the world. It's in Rio. This is Ida B. Wells' housing project in Chicago. They tore down other housing projects in Chicago, Cabrini Green, Robert Taylor Homes, Dearborn. These are all housing projects which were sort of in privileged real estate in Chicago, only 10 minutes walk from the Miracle Mile, amazing downtown. So the idea of displacing marginalized and poorer communities occurs all over the world. It's a worldwide issue. So I was invited to participate in the Shenzhen Biennial of Urbanity and Architecture in 2015, I believe. And so I decided to create a series of photo montages taking the sort of vernacular of these informal settlements and scaling them up to the size of sort of very large luxury developments that you see, office towers, luxury apartments and high rises and retail, and then placing them into sites of sort of like, as I mentioned, this privileged luxury real estate. And so these are all computer images. The photographs are, for the most part, they're composites of photographs I've taken myself or have sourced from the web and have pieced together. And then this is a computer model from SketchUp, placed into the scene, and then sort of overlaying a lot of the materiality from, that you'd see within these communities. And so I did a series, I believe 7 of these images, and just showing them, kind of really existing in these sites. And the idea was, and this is where it gets interesting coming from an architect, saying you're an architect and having an architectural background, but then creating imagery in the art world and presenting it in artistic venues, right? The perception is that architecture solves problems or alleviates issues outside of policy and all of these other factors that actually affect issues. And then looking at the architecture itself and sort of questioning the success of the actual architecture. And so for this, I make a point of saying that this is not about creating a design solution. It's much more about sort of creating discourse around this sort of marginalization of these communities, right? So it's a very, it's not complicated. It's a very simple, straightforward idea. These spaces, like you saw with Cabrini Green, they get torn down. These communities get displaced. No one knows where they go. In Nigeria, these slums can be bulldozed at a whim because some landowner says, I now want to build X, Y, Z on it, and people are given 24 hours to pack up everything they have, and the entire communities are destroyed. So not only a kind of erasure from the sort of critical idea of developments and place of marginalized communities within development, but literally erasure of their buildings, of their homes, of their structures. So I wanted to show these massive building structures sort of overtaking the landscape. As part of this project, there's a development in Nigeria called Eko Atlantic. It's this massive development project, luxury development project, and it's sort of like creating the Dubai of Lagos. And so on YouTube, I found a series of promotional videos, and the promotional videos had these outtakes, like 2-second to 10-second, just brief outtakes of areas of Lagos and skylines that this city could potentially grow into. So I downloaded their video and I chopped out all the outtakes and then I painstakingly CGI'd and inserted my shanty megastructures. So these are actual video stills. I inserted my shanty megastructures into each of these scenes, right? So these are actually moving scenes. And then I uploaded it back to YouTube as a kind of my own promotional. So I kind of hacked into their video, made my own video, uploaded my video back up as my own promotional video for the shanty megastructures, adding in all of the exact same keywords that they had for their video, and hoping that I would not be sued or anything major. There is a copyright infringement tag on the video when you go there, but other than that, it's just existing on the web as a sort of quasi-guerrilla counterpoint to this promotional video. I also created a series of, for the next iteration of this, was shown at the Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology in Lisbon, Portugal, for a show called Utopia, Dystopia, and I created a series of VR environments. So I've now been working at the distance of kind of montage, but then I created these VR moments where you could actually really get inside and see, this work and the scale of it. Because megastructures, these things are actually very, very massive. So you're kind of floating at roughly, 15 feet, but you can really sort of see what it's like inside this world. So I had like five of these VR moments. I have a little drone prop duster right here. So it's a sort of loose kind of urban farming, aquaponics, sort of sustainability practices. One of the other things I was interested in highlighting in this project, let's see if I can navigate back to the video. One of the things I was interested in highlighting in this project, let's see here. In addition to the idea of just visibility, was also looking at some sustainability practice that happened as a function of necessity, right? So it's not only this kind of idea that these communities should be involved in how cities are imagined in the future, but they should have a sort of say. You know, they can actually contribute. It's not necessarily sort of paternalistic. We have to build something for them. There's actually things that they can contribute. And then I did a residency, and this was at the MacDowell Colony. So this was a time to kind of step away from the sort of rigors of the digital space and get involved in a kind of more meditative and calming practice. And so I was actually very productive at MacDowell. It's great when you do a residency and they feed you, right? It kind of takes a lot off the table, you know what I mean? So, and I had one of the live work studios, you know, so I didn't have to, you know, I was right there in my studio. So, I mean, I was working from 7 till like 3 in the morning every day. I did a series of these collages. I call them hi-fi distill. So looking at kind of isometric, you know, drawings from the distill movement, and also sort of primary colors. But my interest in sort of 70s, 60s, 70s audio design that came out of my childhood, particularly in Nigeria. You know, my father was kind of an audiophile and had all these different really cool stereo equipments designed by the Danish in 1970, whatever. So I just did a series of kind of juxtapositions of this fantastical, playful architectural designs with, you know, these different audio components. How we doing on time?
Good.
Okay. All right, so let me know if I need to wrap it up, because simultaneously, afterwards, I thought we were going to see something up. Afterwards, so I got lucky. I've been applying for residencies for years and years, and those urban installation digital images I showed you really landed me in kind of like the yes zone. So in 2016, I applied to 6 residencies. I got accepted to 5. And I was determined to do all of them. So I did MacDowell, but I couldn't do one. I did MacDowell, Headlands, Socrates, and then Bemis, which is in Omaha, Nebraska. So I did these series. The next series was just sort of simple black and white collages. I call them hand-cut collages. I did them while I was at Headlands, which was right after MacDowell. I had like 3 weeks down before I had to go out to Headlands. And this is for my first solo exhibit, which was in London, called Not My Business. And it was about kind of so I was born in Nigeria, but I left when I was 6. So it was sort of creating these architectural follies around my imperfect memories of Nigeria, as well as sort of juxtaposed with a lot of the kind of postmodernist architecture you see in the civic buildings, and a lot of elements and icons of the informal economy. Like you see this motorcycle sort of comprised of what would be a sort of, you know, European housing development that you see a lot in a lot of West African countries. So I did, I think maybe 12 of these, and it's all I did while at Headlands. So I was there for 4 weeks, and I was trying to do 15, but then when I got to 12, I was like, maybe I should just enjoy the environment and go for walks in the last week and not stress myself. I also built a series of accompanying models. So this is called Fair God, and you'll see in Nigeria with a lot of the sort of public transportation. This is one of those 3-wheelers, which you also see very prominent throughout Southeast Asia as well. They always have fascinating bumper stickers and quotes all over them. Very oftentimes religious quotes pertaining to God. People, because they're also incredibly unsafe. So everyone wants to get from point A to B without dying. So I wanted to kind of play around with building a sort of church on top of one of these structures, you know. and this is called Play Juju. It's sort of a throwback to my mom and dad playing, high life juju music when I was young. So it's a mix of kind of interesting sculpture with a tape deck. We also had a projector, and I remember at the time, this is probably like 1982, Flash Gordon was like my favorite movie. And if you ever see Flash Gordon when you've grown up, it might be one of the worst movies ever made. So this idea of, playing again the sort of blend of architectural folly with, this projector that we had where we watch movies. And then also sort of equalizer in the base. And again, the tape deck. This was this past year. I was a Artist in Residence Open Fellows program at the Drawing Center. And so I was using the same sort of visual language as the hand-cut collage for Not My Business, but now taking that sort of same idea and thinking about my neighborhood in Crown Heights, and sort of, again, bringing in the kind of everyday urban detritus and vernacular, and combining it in sort of these playful, whimsical ways, again, to create these architectural follies. And so this one with the bombs over here is called It Sounds Like a Sketchy Block. And this reminds me sort of just before Franklin Avenue got really gentrified in like 2006. I would be on the Brownstoner reading the blogs, people's perception of the neighborhood at the time. And Franklin Park was a beer garden which kind of really cracked it open. But I just remember all the quotes like, I don't know about Franklin, it's a sketchy block. So I made a sort of tenement with a CCTV with these bombs coming down into it as a way of kind of reflecting a lot of those comments that I'd read. And then the other one is We're Gonna Win So Much. And I'll just kind of respond to like Donald Trump and the insanity of this sort of weird, self-destructive jingoism. So this was the most recent iteration of the shanty megastructures. And here's an interesting thing. So this work that I'm showing you right now was exhibited in Munich this past spring as part of a show called African Mobilities, This Is Not Another Refugee Show. And the idea was to sort of challenge people's perception of the way architecture engages with the continents, which people's familiarity of it is very much through this sort of NGO. I'm going to build a school, I'm going to build a healthcare center, I'm going to build a clinic, I'm going to build a... That's people's perception when they think of... So the curator, Pomatsipa, she teaches at Wits in Johannesburg as well as Columbia. She wanted to really expand both the pedagogical and critical discourse. So there was a series of workshops done throughout a bunch of African cities, and commissioned artists and architects ran those workshops. So a lot of really incredible work that really flipped the way people think of engaging with these communities. So I ran a Lagos workshop, and so I gave a lecture at the University of Lagos, Unilag's School of Architecture. Cousin Paul was like, it's important to take this work that you've done, you haven't lived in Nigeria since you were 6, you're so detached, it's important that you place it in front of people from Nigeria, students from Nigeria, and get their feedback, right? So I gave a lecture, much like I'm giving it now. And then when the Q&A opened up, a young woman, she raised her hand, and she completely eviscerated me. She was like, why are you making ruin porn for the consumption of Western media? This is ridiculous. And she was like, almost yelling. She was so angry, she was shaking. And she said, I'm sorry, I'm so mad, I'm shaking. And she just completely was like, this is ridiculous. Look at this. Why are you showing this? It makes it look like, we're backwards. And, why not focus on the positive? And again, that comes back to the sort of perception of what architecture can do. Also what it should do. Also a question. I mean, it would be presumptuous of me to believe that I would show this work and not expect feedback and not want feedback. So I say all of that to sort of discuss the kind of premise of this, because then another student stood up afterwards and then said, well, no, we have to interrogate why a particular vernacular sort of makes you think luxury. And it was like, because to me, this doesn't necessarily look like a bad thing. It uses local materials, etc. After she said what she said, the whole room erupted in applause. And then after he said what he said, maybe 3/4 of the room erupted in applause. So there was a very spirited debate over the kind of work. But what I ended up doing for this was collaborating with a young writer from Lagos, Wale Lawal, and I told him about the shanty megastructures world. And I said, just come up with 3 stories. And I didn't give him any direction. I said, this is what the world is. You know, you're from Lagos, you know, make these, you know, write 3 short stories and I will animate whatever you make. And I gave him, you know, a couple parameters. I said, let's focus on a settlement, a smaller setting, maybe a shop, and another setting, maybe interior of a home. So this was for the first one, Ominira, and so what he ended up doing was creating an even further marginalized community of shipping containers, but then had all this sort of complicated aquaponic systems running within them. However, for getting protein in fish, the story is about a father and his daughter illegally fishing in sort of these privatized fisheries owned, you know, by these foreign national companies, and sort of what happens. So I then built the world, and again, this is SketchUp, and I built this, you know, so he described it, and I built it all up, and kind of animated this short story. The next one took place inside a tech shop, and it's called Offline. So he created this world where you are required to be online, sort of the way you are taxed. And so in the back rooms of this computer shop, and this is modeled off of, in Lagos, there's a market called Market 12 and Computer Village. And you know, these places where you can get an enormous amount of electronics and mobile phones and computer parts and electronic parts and all this other stuff. But in the back of the shop is a sort of hidden lounge where you can don these masks and inhale psychotropic drugs and, you know, completely drift away from being online 24/7. And again, I was like, just imagining that world. And then this one is Dreamscape, and it goes back into shanty megastructures, now looking on the inside of sort of what this world is about. And it's about an individual who works 20 hours a day, and everyone who's part of this world is given a sort of finite life sentence to sort of deal with overpopulation. So this is the last 7 minutes of this individual's life. And working in this space is terrible, but each individual has an assisted dreaming system, so that every night they can dream and live as long as they want to in these dreams and select various dreams. So this is about, as I mentioned, the last 7 minutes of this person's life. And show the video, I think I already have it queued up.
Wished most of all to die a new man. There was evening in his studio apartment in Mushi, which he hated, for this part of Lagos was noisy, with the horns of vehicles outside. Though his room was noticeably small and decrepit, the room was the only thing in his life capable of bringing him joy. A young man in his early He was finishing up on his shaper when he began to wonder what would be the smoothest way to die. Once done with cutting his hair, he took a look at the result, and there's a difference about what he saw. In the mirror, he was unsmiling, hardened, not much older than he was. A holographic lifetime on his forehead claimed he had 9 minutes and 2 seconds left to live. Hey, how will you be this night? Here's your destination for Lagos, studio behind firewall.
That's true, man. All my entertainment activity are related to further notice.
I beg, forget that one. Now what have you dreamed today?
Don't forget your dream guide, sir.
The AI said, until he reached to the side of his bed for a bottle of pills. He swallowed one, and the walls of his room suddenly dissolved into pitch blackness. According to the light timer on his forehead, Sheikh only had 7 minutes and 48 seconds left to live.
What do you want for this night, okay?
Show me the latest, he replied. Gradually, the walls of his room transformed into a satellite image of Earth from space. User not allowed, the screen read. Guy use proxy bypass. Code 9246692466.
You are now dreaming a secure network.
What followed them was a catalogue of 6 newly added destinations.
Would you like a trip to Korea Island? Or would you like scuba dive in the Pacific Ocean? One of you called it the best thing ever. You won't regret it.
Just give me Mars.
You have selected Mars. The Mars experience is audio compatible. This means you can accompany this dream with an audiobook or music.
Give me Genesis from the Bible.
The book of Genesis is available in more than 1,000 languages.
Give me Yoruba.
Congratulations, you're about to begin dreaming. Being buried, nígbà tí ọmọ dáhùn àti ayé, ayé lójú ojú, ó sì ṣòfò. Mo ní gbogbo ayé, gbogbo rẹ̀.
The AI is real, soothes Sheikh, who like many in this world, lived another person's borrowed time. The Shikonis of this world were laborers born to repay the debts of their fathers, sold as ideas before they were born. Dreams helped them to cope, and to them, there was nothing kinder than assisted dreaming. The dream guide he had swallowed allowed him a vision of space, and not stars and distant galaxies he saw, the walls reflected. By the time he arrived at the red swallows of Mars, he was fast asleep.
All right. It's a good time to open it up for questions.
Sure, sounds great. Thank you so much. Fantastic to see, and just wonderful in so many different ways. I guess if I'll start with the question, one of the things I was struck with continuously is how much all of your artwork is so architectural. It's there. Like I see it in every project, all the way through it. And yet, when you describe it as whimsical or playful or silly architecture, I'm playing around. And at the same time, it's amongst some of the most politically provocative architectural work I know. And there's so many other architects that are being rigorous and exhaustive and thorough, and yet getting nowhere near the provocations that you're getting at. And I guess my question in a certain way is, do you find, is there something with crossing between art and architecture that gives you the freedom to make those steps, or do you find that within an art world, when you present this, do you get a very different kind of response, or do you present it in a different way? Or where in that kind of mix allows you to do things that architects would be afraid to do, yet what I see is you're doing it in a very architectural manner and succeeding through the aesthetics to make a political provocation?
Yeah, no, I think sort of operating in the art world realm definitely gives you that freedom. You know what I mean? And it's funny because that's sort of what I say is that my artwork is inspired by my architectural background, but very, very specifically by my architectural educational background, right? And the idea of having a project and setting the parameters and setting the rules, right? You know, whether, you know, we're given, we have to design for this or that, or whether the program is this or that. What makes your own architectural project your own, what makes you the author, is that you have to set those rules. And the divide between our architectural education and our practice is vast to a certain extent, right? Even if you are operating in an academic, once you've graduated, there's still the pressures for the kind of architectural, historical, you know, pedagogical writing and work that you do, right? But if you're in the art realm, the sort of the critical rigor in that regard and the politics of that are not as apparent and are not as constricting, right? So then I think that in terms of the artwork, I can make a lot of exceptions, you know, to how rigorous I am, you know what I mean, to how much research I do. At the end of the day, it's very much a kind of visual project for me, and I don't want to take away from that. And I was one of the, and I was, you know, when I was an architecture students, they're kind of, well, there's many kinds, but I would always distill it to two types: those who obsess over an enormous amount of research and don't get to the making of things, you know what I mean? Because they're so hamstrung by all the things they have to consider before they make, right? And then there's those who make and then do a kind of post-rationale or kind of go back and forth between analysis and research, but are driven by creating things first and then kind of, you know, bumping what you create up against the logic of your ideas and your narratives. So for me, yeah, there's an enormous amount of freedom to do that kind of work. And I don't resent it in the art world. It can get frustrating. For instance, like I mentioned, you know, when the young woman eviscerated me, but I also got killed online, you know what I mean? CNN did a story on shanty megastructures, and I did this interview with them, and I explained what it was about, and then they just slapped a title on it and said, "Is this the future of Lagos?" So it completely changed what I was talking about and making the scene. So then I started getting all these DMs and hate mails from people from Nigeria saying, "What do you mean, is this the skyline, this backward?" You know what I mean? So it's interesting, you know, for me, and it's actually exciting to see, and I think that's why I personally do very well with criticism, because I love seeing what people think about it. You know what I mean? I love hearing what they say, and I have enormous blind spots. There absolutely is an aspect of this work that is ruin porn, because that's what I like. That's also what I, you know, said in my answer. I was like, I like dystopias because what they do, because in that genre of science fiction, almost all science fiction is a dystopia, because you take an issue and you project it into the future and you either exacerbate that issue, specifically in film and literature, right? And the world is just gone to hell, right? Or if you resolve that issue, it is at the expense or at the sacrifice of something huge, you know? Which you discover in all utopian science fiction. You realize we're eating people, or you realize that we can no longer have emotions, or you realize that we have to dress a certain way. You know what I mean? There's a kind of dystopian sacrifice in service of a utopia, almost like a utopia simply doesn't exist. And so it's that freedom to explore those ideas, explore contemporary issues in the realm of fantasy and science fiction that like I enjoy and feel like I can work a lot more with that than doing the sort of bottom-up, community engagement analysis of the issues and working in that way. So yeah.
So, and what was your response to that take that CNN took, or to those critics? Like, what was your answer?
One of my answers was, please read the article, not just the title. Because people weren't getting what the gist of it was. It was like, and that's the interesting thing when you're doing architecture is that, like I mentioned, there's just a fundamental belief that architecture is here to solve a problem. So if you do something architectural and it's exacerbating or illuminating a problem, then it throws everyone off when they think of architecture. Why are you doing architecture? You know what I mean? And then they put you into this, why don't you do X, Y, Z? Which for me is very funny and interesting because you wouldn't say to Stephen King, why don't you write a romantic novel? It's not what he writes, you know what I mean? So for me, it's almost the exact same thing. I wouldn't do that because that's not what I like to do, you know what I mean? But you don't have that kind of freedom as an author, at least in people's perception, to be like, I like to write horror architecture novels. I like to write comedic, you know what I mean? I like to, it's like, no, you are supposed to do good. You are supposed to, So that was my response. It was just like, if you can imagine that I'm an author and I'm a storyteller and that this is the genre in which I want to work in because it's what I like to write, and what I like to depict, can you then, meet me halfway and kind of do a little reframing of how you may look at the work, So
if you were, can we?
Sure.
So if you were commissioned
mm-hmm.
to do this, would you say yes? What, like, I mean, if I like some of the, I think that many of these ready-mades where you are dialing up certain aspects of reality
mm-hmm.
have a tone of criticism.
Mm-hmm.
I could imagine you being commissioned a taxi that has, that these religious aspects are enhanced.
Mm-hmm.
Or you've even said that some cosmetic luxury brands have approached you.
Mm-hmm.
So in those, I can imagine you saying obviously yes
Yeah.
to doing those commissions, even if they have an aspect of criticism and, or Michael would use the word provocation.
Mm-hmm.
But what about these others? Like, are these?
I would, right? I would love to build, you know what I mean? I would love to build, and if I was given the kind of freedom to work in this particular way, but then I understand the sort of, I would understand the constraints, right? And as you said, and it's so funny because I didn't get to it, but I'm doing a lot of public art work now. That is artwork that I do, so large scale sculpture and 2D work, and public art is for the most part commemorative in some way and celebratory in some way, right? But then sometimes I do slip in a little provocation, and I do say something, If I can show this, as soon as this.
Then I don't think it belongs completely to the world of sci-fi or utopia or dystopia or criticism or irony. I think it's something in between, and I don't know what it is, but I find it super fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because neither venue is able to reconcile the other. I have the same problems in kind of architecture world as I do in art world. You know what I mean? With how architectural is this work? How art, you know what I mean? How then without those expectations is it in the art world? And especially moving into the art world, for the longest time, the kind of work I was doing wasn't really understood, and art world wants you to kind of locate yourself amongst your contemporaries and what other people are doing, But an example of the provocations is this was commissioned by Forrest Ratner, a huge developer in downtown Brooklyn. in one of their luxury high-rises in their sort of storefront window. And so when I gave him the first sort of sketch, it was, you know, just showing, you know, this decal of curtain walls, and Fort Greene Park is very nearby, so I was like, I'm gonna have vegetation weaving through, and I'm gonna have this kind of hanging, gilded bird cage thing, right? And they were like, okay, that's cool. And then I added the CCTV cameras because it's a luxury building and there's people who don't have access to it, right? And it was funny. Then, you know, I presented it in their lounge, and it was like the developer sort of liaison was like, I see what you did, right? And he was like, I bet that wasn't in the initial sketch, was it? And I was like, nah, it wasn't. He's like, okay, fair enough. He like recognized the kind of, you know, because there are cameras all around there, and it is a lobby, and there is a, you know, and you do need an ID to get in, you know, and it is part of the sort of like kind of, you know, large development that displaces and isolates certain folks. So I mean, yeah, sometimes I'll, you know, do things like that, and this is in Cleveland, but although this is for sort of a site where, you know, demonstration is allowed and sanctioned, so this was sort of more appropriate with, you know, it. But yeah, you know, the kind of the expectations change when you're dealing with the community directly, right? As opposed to I'm thinking of these communities in a general sense, right? I'm thinking of the favelas, or I'm thinking of South African townships, you know, Johannesburg townships or whatever. But when you then have to go in and build or create and interact a lot more, and that's sort of the factors that changes being an architect. So I mean, that's part of kind of figuring it all out with very, very architectural artwork, but being a visual artist.
So I want to ask the same question now a third time.
Mm-hmm.
Harry Cobb is going to come here in a few weeks. He just published a new book, which has to do with a series of essays. And one of the essays that he talks about articulates the reasons why he likes being an architect, or argues for what constitutes the architectural problem. It's a predicament of having to advance a particular discipline, but at the same time it's in the service of things that have to work a certain way, in the service of people. And these things are often in conflict with each other, but you have to reconcile them somehow. So he turns the problem of constraint into a positive thing. Now, within that context, one of the artists that I've always very, very much appreciated, and this may be a mischaracterization of your work, but I'm trying to channel them together, is the work of Thomas Saraceno. And I've always said that he's one of those architects who had to leave the discipline, who had to leave the profession in order to advance the discipline. In other words, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but he also has a very distinct narrative vision about, you know, a world without gravity, or you know, an engagement with the sky and space and all of that. And some of these may come from sci-fi, but they come from other sources also. But in his case, if you know him, he's maniacal about actually building them. Because you can't build them here and here, but you can build them in the context of the museum, and the museum becomes the very mechanism that liberates him to do the things that nobody else would do. And so, given the incredible and profound depth that you've been able to establish in the sensibilities of your work as an artistic narrative within the context of drawing, painting, etc., etc., Igor's question becomes more poignant if the moment you start building them, because it brings you back to issues of construction and detailing and tectonics that you wouldn't want to compromise on if you could do this, because it changes it. And I at that point, I wonder where your allegiance begins to veer off to, or how does your architecture change as a consequence of that?
No, it's interesting you say that, because now as I do more public art, those are the considerations that I have to take into account. And it is also an advantage for me coming from an architectural background, because I speak about it in the same way. I speak about the design challenge as a liberating challenge, right? And I do believe that it is, right? You know what I mean? Even sort of a budgetary constraint. What can I now do? You know what I mean? A materiality constraint. Seasonal, the weather, the change, you know what I mean? What can I now do? I find it very, very exciting. So in that regard, it's kind of less about seeing it as restrictive, and it's about doing the things that I want to do quickly. You know what I mean? And that's where the sort of freedom for the shanty mega, you know, the fact that I can build these very quickly and I can examine them very quickly. So there's an idea of sort of getting to the things that I want to say, right? And that's why I sort of discuss the juxtaposition between I'm sitting in front of my computer all day long doing all of this, but then when I go to the residencies and I'm doing stuff by hand, it's more meditative. I slow down. I'm much more thoughtful about the time it takes to do this, how to cut this, how to model this, how to build it. And the same sort of sensibility that I would bring to then doing, you know, projects that need to be built, that need to be fabricated.
Did anything change with the Coachella piece? Is that the biggest thing you've built so far?
Yeah, that's the biggest one I've done. Yeah.
An image of that?
Oh yeah, that was yeah. I don't know which one I want to say. So yeah, that was an interesting thing is this. So I was found by the assistant curator Rafi Lehrer, who you know, because I did the Headlands residency. So while I was at Headlands, he just contacted their director. First, he went to the website to look at current artists, and it was perfect because I was there. And I was there from April to May, and that was just before, you know, around the Coachella time. And they're already looking for next year's artists. And so he asked them, who do you think, you know, you could work with to do something? And the hi-fi distill work, which I did at MacDowell, was what inspired this. This came directly out of that. They saw those collages, and they said, do you think you could reimagine one of those in some way at 30, 50 feet tall? And I said, of course, it's Coachella. But this was easier because they have an endless budget, an enormous amount of money. They have their fabricators, they have engineers. So I just provided drawings and kind of went back and forth with them. Other ones require, of course, you know, me working and figuring it out, you know, figuring out even protest, you know, which was just these large water jet cut steel profiles, required, you know, 3 tons of concrete bags to be placed into the bench. So I liked that kind of thing, right? But the ability to say something very quickly about a particular issue, especially a broad, expansive issue, such as the lack of housing, you know, considerations in these communities. You know, my familiarity with the digital world, the fact that I personally move very quickly in the digital world. You know, at this point, I can get to what I want to get to a lot faster. You know, and oftentimes I have a very small window to do that. The adverse speak, I had 2 months to do that. So, you know, and like I said, my friend Maddie, he wrote a whole dissertation. So I have to build this world out very quickly and have to figure out a way to do it. So it's more of a function of kind of compressing time and how much I can say about a certain project, you know. But I would be very fascinated to, you know, imagine reaching into small moments of adverse speak and maybe, you know, retrofitting a bodega around the agri-speak idea and thinking about it. You know what I mean? Those, those are part of the whole sort of conversation. And it's interesting because I'm not at all dogmatic about any of it, right? So, and it's all part of the conversation. You know what I mean? It's like, so it's very important. Kunle Adeyemi's sort of floating school, bottom-up floating school that he did in Makoko, though, was like, and that's a perfect example of very well-meaning architecture completely crippled by a lack of infrastructure, a lack of local oversight, Lagos state government. They didn't want to have anything to do with it except for sort of feed off of the positive press that it got, right? They didn't want to maintain it, and Kunle, he can't now direct his entire firm's resources to, looking after this project, and the community itself doesn't have the money or the resources to look after. So it just became a nightmare, right? So it's a perfect example of what happens when you have every well-meaning intention to do this bottom-up project and thinking about how it works and all of the tectonics and structure and all of it works, but just a simple function of maintaining something on a lagoon when you have storms, violent storms during the rainy season, you know what I mean, for 4 months. It doesn't matter how good your architecture is, it doesn't matter how well-meaning it is. And not to be at all doomsday, it's like you can never do good, but that's just an example of the sort of...
So many of these issues involve so many different people at so many different levels and so many different disciplines in so many different ways that to think that we can solve them as architects is often what shoots us in the foot. And I think that what you said at one level is it's raising and creating the possibilities of discourse. So the argument that it seems like you had at that presentation in Lagos, I think is perfect. Because if you can get people to start arguing about where and how these issues sit, culturally, politically, socially, and economically, through the images that you're producing, through the aesthetics that you're producing, you're doing a huge amount of work right there that maybe, hopefully, let's say, motivates a different discursive discussion around those things. And I think that's very architectural to do so.
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. It was really extraordinary. And I think, I don't know, maybe we are all going to just ask the same question over and over again. The work is super provocative, and so maybe it tends to drive us all in a direction. But so I'm struck by two things. One is I think, I may not be right, but I think I may be right that there are no, in your digital construction, so Legos for, as powerful as I think the project is as a provocation, there are no people in your city. So there are no inhabitants in any of your projects until the last one where your colleague, your co-author who was the writer, populates those places with stories and at least in one of them a figure. So, a true inhabitant. And for me there was something that shifted remarkably in the kind of power that re-enters the conversation when there's that, at least an entry point of an empathic condition that the figure brings into your provocation. So that was kind of my A feeling, and then the B point is that, so for you now it seems that there are physical things that you've made that makes the idea of the material versus the digital not just an academic one for you. So, you've actually had the experience, you've built some things, you have the pieces in space. Yes, they're slower. Yes, they're not as complex. Yes, the narrative maybe is not as expansive, but there they are, they're in space. And how do you, as an artist, respond to them in terms of how you're drawn to the digital versus now you have these things in material space, and do they have an authority that the digital realm does not? So I think, I guess it pivots on the person.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question. Because I usually mention that when I first start showing the city settlements, the sort of painterly ones, And I know they're completely devoid. So again, for me, that comes back to looking back at a world that exists before us, but we are looking back at it, and you know, it's like looking at a Chernobyl or something, and you're sort of imagining who was there. The interesting thing is that I don't have the renderings in here, but the sort of 1.5, I have a bunch of renderings that have people in it, you know, and market women and selling, and but that's a very point that you mentioned that, because that was absence from it, and you're right, it's kind of like the absence of the empathic. So then it also becomes, you can see my detachment as well, right? And that definitely does pose a kind of issue, especially when one says they're doing work that acknowledges the community. It doesn't have anyone in it, right? So yeah, I definitely understand, and it's interesting because that is absolutely a blind spot that I like getting pointed out. Like, you're right, it's interesting that you talk about this, but there's not a single person, even a scale member from this community, in this kind of imagery. And it's definitely something that I thought about as I then evolved through the iterations of this project. So regarding building in the sort of physical realm now, and so in response to that, you know, what this kind of human interaction changes for me has been incredibly rewarding, right? So for an example, with the Coachella one here, I had to, you know, because it's nothing but a bunch of drunk high children running around, they didn't want me to have a plinth. I initially had a plinth that was maybe like 5 feet, you know, and ornate. They were like, there's nothing but liabilities for us, right? And, but I was like, if these are just coming out of the ground, number one, aesthetically and compositionally, there's an imbalance. There's a balance that I want to create. But also the idea of this is that these are a community, sort of abstracted, geometric, brutalistic kind of community that you can't access, right? But I wanted to do something for those who are festival goers, right? One thing is it casts a huge shadow. It gets up to 115 degrees there. So I wanted to create, you know, a place where you can step into the shade and kind of like, you know, relax a little bit. And then also, I had to fight back and forth with the fire marshal to get the plinth, which was 3 steps. So first, I was like, can we get 5 steps, 12 inches each? They're like, we can't do that. So it's like, almost like barter system, you know? Or like playing cards or something. Like, can we get 3 steps at 10 or 8 or 5 steps at 6? And finally it was 3 steps at 10 inches, which created a substantial plinth. And now, I don't know if I have images here, but yeah, you see people kind of like leaning back against the trunks. And so the idea of, so the idea of this was sort of like the tree is from time immemorial the gathering space for oral histories and entertainment and everything, which is very fitting for a musical festival. So I wanted people to kind of rest at the base of the tree. And so a lot of that happened, you know, because these are folks who've been out there all day and they're tired, so they're hanging out. So then to see that engagement, you know, was something that was, for me, this being my very first public art project, was very much a kind of rewarding and exciting thing, where I'm like, you know, let's not leave it all behind now, you know what I mean? And same with protest as well, especially seeing, you know, the March for Our Lives and seeing this image. So I created four images of individuals involved in different forms of that protest, from a more kind of aggressive, impassioned, challenging the system, to like the passive, the man handing out flyers, or less abrasive, if you will, and then to a moment of kind of reconciliation along there, either for 2 protesters from opposing viewpoints or, you know, from the same side, you know, providing sort of safe space for each other. And then to see like the young girl, you know, kind of standing on it, you know, amidst this protest, which I believe was for, there were 2 major ones. There was one about Planned Parenthood, or about a lot of the sort of gender rights issues. And then there was the assault rifle one, the March for Our Lives. And so, you know, a kind of tone of seeing this image with that image, and knowing what those protests were about and seeing how well the work kind of complemented that interaction was something that was very exciting for me, and knowing and working digitally from its inception and, working with the scale and building it up until, 8 months later, seeing it in this particular protest was something that I was like, okay, I liked I like that idea, you know what I mean, of creating those moments and those engagements.
I appreciate all of your works, and including the one that you did at K-pop architecture and the Center of Architecture a few blocks down the way.
Okay.
And I noticed there's a feature of overflow of information in all of your works. Take your gentrification diagrams, you're fragmenting buildings into pieces of information that are almost identifiable. And even the example of Afrofuturism, it's so fascinating a topic because without, if we erase the history of colonialism, there are infinite possibilities that this continent can develop. And if you bring that topic into the topic of megastructures, I find something paradoxical in there. Megastructures in real life is actually a mechanism of unifying, of the state control. Instead of overflow information is actually organizing and simplifying and then controlling this information. But in your works, you are using megastructure as a manifestation of fragmented information of this organic and self-generating structures. I just imagine if that structure exists in the real world, and what do you think what do you think its political implications? Does that represent the sort of modernity that you were expecting instead of the female student that raised the question to you, instead of her notion of modernity? What do you think about that, if that actually emerges in real life?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of the earlier stuff, I feel like, that you said in your question, I feel like I want to add to my artist statement now. So thank you for that. The idea of, sort of large structures being a function of kind of state organization and control. That's an interesting idea because initially the idea of shanty megastructures was making it big to make it hyper visible, a counterpoint to all the large scale development that you see all over the world. The big Trump Tower, the this, the that, saying, okay, well, let's do it as well. But then the idea being that it would evolve and grow in a way that is, you mentioned is very organic and kind of informal, because that was one of the initial ideas behind the way it would look and how it would meander and spread over, the urban landscape and through the highways and join the highways and veer off. Was an idea of, in looking at a lot of these settlements and even visiting Makoko, and it looks completely random, but when you visit the site, there's incredibly strict rules on how you can build and where you can build. There's nothing random about it at all. Every single zone in that settlement has a community leader, and if you marry someone, you want to start a family based on ecological factors, environmental factors, the way this thing is growing, spatial factors, they will tell you where you can build your house. You know what I mean? So there's nothing, you know what I mean? So it's kind of a tightly controlled sort of logic around it, and I wanted to sort of address that in a kind of sci-fi inspired way. Now logistically, I don't know what kind of structural nightmare that would be, or how well resources could be mobilized to have something like that grow organically at that scale, right? We're not there, you know what I mean? There cannot be a massive superstructure, organic development. It just can't, it just can't happen. So it's more of a kind of far-reaching idea. But it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I actually named the world and it's chat, because mobile technology drives the African continent, right? It's probably the most important technology. So I'm using those terms, and chat stands for a chaotic, anarcho technocracy, right? And then shanty megastructures is SMS. So in my little futuristic reimagining is a chat SMS system, which speaks very much to the mobile technology and my love of naming things. So I mean, yeah, that's something to think about. And it's interesting because when I've shown the work, because there have been, when I've shown them in architectural venues, individuals who want it to be real. And you know, per your comment about it sort of pushing the discourse, that ended up being a real thing because I was invited in 2016 to be a keynote speaker at a symposium in Berlin for the AEDES, A-E-D-E-S, did I say? AEDES? Yeah, exactly. And it was a real symposium about development of the sub-Saharan city, you know, the sub-Saharan African city. And and it's funny because I don't really get imposter syndrome, but there was a moment of like, what am I doing here? Because I'm reading the bio of the other keynote speakers, and one was a woman who went to MIT and runs a robotic lab in Kenya and is responsible for organizing the routes the garbage trucks take for efficiency and waste management and all of this, but highly technological and pedigree upon pedigree, you know what I mean? All this stuff. And then another guy is the UN director of housing, for the UN. And then it's like Lake Artist. So I was like, but that's a prime example that they found the work and they wanted, you know, whatever I was doing, and they asked me specifically to discuss two projects, shanty megastructures and the microscopic cell urban growth ones that I'd shown you, because they felt just it would contribute to the way then more, you know, practicing developers or whoever may just begin to think, you know what I mean? It couldn't help. It couldn't hurt for, you know, those who actually have access to policy and developing infrastructure and writing, policy and allocating of funds and resources. There was an idea that it couldn't hurt for them to see work like this. So I mean, it's very interesting, you know, because as I mentioned, I initially just made a very clear line between what the work's responsibility was, you know, what I intended, but then over time, you know, folks like, you know, those at Berlin and other folks will reach out and say, well, no, we think it can have an impact in kind of very real practical, like in a very real practical sense.
I would say right on to that. Yeah, we would argue with Cooper that it's necessary for you to be at the table.
Yeah, interesting.
It's getting late. Is there any last question burning out there that people want to ask?
I guess I just have a quick question. When you make your art and architectural work, do you ever receive critique where, if you're proposing this as architecture in a sense where it's like your concept, do you receive critique where it's considered like impressionistic, or this idea is so far-fetched that it doesn't attribute to certain ideas in your presentation, or it's just something that I came across in critiques, where someone calls the work impressionistic, and the idea that we should be trying to get to maybe a bit more formal, or there's an architectural concept that I'm not touching on because of this impressionistic.
Yeah, definitely sometimes. And I mean, that's all part of the kind of discourse. You know, he mentioned the work that I have up in the hip hop exhibit for Center for Architecture, you know, and so, you know, that entire premise, I've seen a lot of online chatter about that work being impressionistic and not touching upon, or you know what I mean, and I mean, just for me it's just really all up for debate, and like I like those kind of conversations, right? Because at times that is the kind of work that I'm doing, you know what I mean? I think all of us are. I think even the most intense gatekeepers of whatever traditions and practices, even, you know what I mean, no one is immune from that kind of, you know, from those kind of considerations and having to think about those things. And I mean, it's just part of producing, you know, a particular type of work and part of articulating your work in a particular way. An interesting thing is you can change if you talk about it in a very different way, you know what I mean? I was just in reviews, the Yale's MArch-1 program, and it was just funny, cause, you know, I hadn't been on one since I guess back in May, and I'm not in the academic world regularly, but it's just funny seeing how far left it can all go when you say one thing and no one believes it, right? And the job of the critic when you're, you know, when they're reviewing your work is to sort of like pay attention to what you think you're doing and the rules you've set up for yourself, and then see how well, according to their own precedents and presumptions and experience, they feel you are doing that. And I think it's that way with anything else, you know what I mean? So people bring their own ideas about the kind of work that you're doing, you know, to the kind of work you're doing. And sometimes you really are doing that work, you know? And that's something you gotta have to acknowledge as well. And then the question is, do you wanna lean into it, you know, or do you wanna dial it back and take the criticism as something that you should really take into consideration? And I've done both. Sometimes I've been like, yeah, you know, I'm definitely operating in a kind of privileged detachment here, and I need to think about X, Y, Z. And at other times I've been like, would you tell Stephen King to write a romance novel? So I mean, it's always a case-by-case kind of thing. So, yeah.
Because it's like when you present, when people critique as provocative work, sometimes that work comes with like loaded information or like loaded statements that it's making, and it's like receiving that critique. Like when you gauge it, like you said, is it do I sit and digest this and come back to it and use the critique as suggestion? Which I think being receptive to critique is what we should be doing, and then also having that also step back where it's like, would you tell Stephen King to write?
Yeah.
Which is
yeah. I mean, it's interesting. It's very interesting because architecture in the art world is still a vastly misunderstood thing, right? And there's been so few architecture art exhibits, you know what I mean? Or at least a kind of clearly curated thematic, these are the architects, and you know, these are the whatever, these are the, it's interesting. I see a kind of apprehension, a misunderstanding, a misreading of it all the time of what it is and what, you know. And it's interesting, well, the fine arts world is such an interesting world because it is very much of this sort of highly elitist space, right? You can be at the top of your game as a comic artist, but you cannot transition in the fine art as a comic artist. But yet an artist who's existed in the art world, like Roy Lichtenstein, can do a comic art and either technically or even conceptually be far beneath someone who is in that world. And it's like, no, you can never cross over into their world. You're you know what I mean? So there's moments of kind of a pretentiousness around it as well, you know, which has been so interesting for me in the architectural world, where even as students is where we learn a kind of certain level of craftsmanship. And I remember going to see shows, you know, when I just graduated, going to art shows and seeing like the glue, you know, looking at works in galleries and seeing like glue and smudge, you know what I mean, and things that we just don't really, we try really hard not to do. And I remember my friend who's like, and he's now a very successful artist. But I remember going to a show at the Jack Tilton Gallery and looking at an artist's work, and he was looking at the collage and all these smudges and glue stains you could really see. And he was just like, how is this not a travesty? You know what I mean? And I'm like, this is art world. It's very different. It's you know what I mean? It's fascinating because there's so many things we learn coming up through an architectural education that doesn't have any kind of value in a kind of MFA or fine arts education, you know what I mean? And probably, you know, the same thing over in our kind of world as well. It's a very fascinating, space to like navigate back and forth through.
I think we should call. Yeah?
Yep.
We could go all night, but maybe not. Thank you so much.
I know, thanks.